This more broadly across the whole federal government. The administration's already laid off tens of thousands of folks who are in their first few years of service, and it's causing real challenges for us in our national security workforce, in the firefighting workforce across the country, whether it's in our national parks or it's in the intelligence services.
You mentioned USAID, and this week a judge ordered the Trump administration to unfreeze foreign aid spending, saying plaintiffs showed a strong preliminary showing of irreparable harm. Other recent decisions have blocked the administration's efforts to dismantle, again, the U.S. Agency for International Development. Will these decisions hold, Senator, and what are the consequences if they don't?
Well, I hope they will, but frankly, what's more urgent is that the money get turned back on because there are so many different nonprofits that work in partnership with USAID around the world. Nonprofits that are household names like World Vision or Catholic Relief Services, Save the Children, or CARE that are already publicly announcing that they have laid off hundreds or thousands of their staff around the world in life-saving missions. I hope that the judge's order will be respected, that the layoffs and firings and the freezing of funding will be reversed. But there's already significant harm to our trustworthiness, our reliability as a partner, and to life-saving work that's done around the world. And I'll remind you, Alex, it's just 1% of our total federal spending that goes into programs through USAID. I have visited them in many countries, and I think they do good and reliable work around the world in partnership with nonprofits that Americans know.
That is a sentiment shared by many, many people around the world, Senator. Let me get to the Munich Security Conference where you are and where there is also much anxiety around Donald Trump's handling of the war in Ukraine following his call with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth left some confusion after his comments about Ukraine before then backtracking on some of that. Senate Armed Services Committee Chairman Republican Roger Wicker was critical of Hegseth's comments, calling them a rookie mistake. I'm curious your reaction, and are you clear on the U.S. policy on Ukraine in this administration?
I am not at all clear on what the Trump administration's negotiating strategy is and what their policy is. I'm with a large bipartisan delegation from the Senate here. There's another one from the House. And we've met with literally a dozen European heads of state, foreign ministers, defense ministers here today. These are trusted NATO allies and partners who've stood alongside us as Americans have served with them in Afghanistan and Iraq and who have now worked with us to support Ukraine. Europeans have provided more military and budgetary and humanitarian support for Ukraine than we have. It's roughly equal, but it's slightly more from the Europeans. And they're asking, how is it possible that President Trump's Secretary of Defense would have given away some of the key negotiating points before they even got to the table? One of the core concerns I've raised today, as have many others, is that Ukraine needs to be at the table. Our European partners need to be at the table if we're going to negotiate a just and lasting peace after the sacrifice of tens of thousands of brave Ukrainians who have fought for their freedom and pushed back against the Russian army. I think it would be a betrayal of their sacrifice if there is not a robust security guarantee for Ukraine and if Ukraine is not at the table.
Joining me now from the Munich Security Conference is California Senator Adam Schiff. Welcome, Senator. It's awfully good to have you on the show. So I'd like first, sir, to get your response to Vice President J.D. Vance's speech at the conference there yesterday, where he berated European leaders on a whole host of issues. What do his comments reveal about the Trump administration and our commitment to NATO?
They were really shocking and so disappointing when what I think our allies needed to hear was a renewed commitment by America to NATO, to our European partners, a willingness to stand up to the Kremlin and make sure that we provide Ukraine with all of the help that it needs to fight this war of aggression by Russia. But instead, what Europe got was a lecturing, a condescension, a demeaning speech that really I think just attacked our allies. It was greeted, I think, enthusiastically in one place, and that was the Kremlin. exactly the wrong message right now.
Well, for sure, because President Trump, to your point, signaled this week an open mind to Vladimir Putin ending the war on his terms. Trump suggested Ukraine could be excluded from his negotiations with Putin. You had Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth saying it's unrealistic for Ukraine to return to its pre-2014 borders or to expect NATO membership. How do you interpret that framing? And big picture, where does it leave Ukraine?
Well, Donald Trump likes to pride himself on being a great negotiator, but it's hard to imagine going to a negotiation with a worse posture than the one that's been articulated by the president and Secretary of Defense. Why on earth would you go into a negotiation conceding things that should never be conceded? So deeply hurtful, harmful. In terms of Ukraine and NATO, that's up to Ukraine and NATO. Russia doesn't get a veto over who belongs to NATO, not now, nor should they ever.
Senator, do you find that your colleagues in the Senate are supportive of this approach that we're hearing at the Munich Security Conference, or is there bipartisan support for Ukraine?
There is really strong bipartisan support for Ukraine. We sat down on a bipartisan basis with Zelensky yesterday, and I think all around the table, we expressed our appreciation for the heroic sacrifice Ukraine has made, the fact that we want to maintain a strong level of support for Ukraine. So I think Zelensky heard that loud and clear from the U.S. Senate on a bipartisan basis. And I hope that we can allay some of the concerns that have been raised by the real mixture of messages that Europe, Russia, and Ukraine have been getting from the Oval Office and from the Defense Department.
But do you think that is reaching President Zelensky? Because as you know, just today, he said that he doesn't think Europe can count on the United States any longer, that Europe has to create its own army and learn to defend itself better in the wake of potentially losing U.S. support.
Well, I have to think Zelensky is concerned when he hears, on the one hand, pretty strong bipartisan support for Ukraine in Congress, but he hears different messages and conflicting messages from the administration. I think he, like the rest of the world, is trying to figure out what does that all mean and where is the center of gravity in this new government. So I can understand the apprehension that he must feel. I certainly will be working my hardest in the Senate, and I'll have a lot of allies in this in fighting for strong support for Ukraine and no concessions to the Kremlin.
Let's go stateside here as the attorneys general in 14 states have filed a lawsuit against Elon Musk, arguing that his unbridled power to dismantle entire government agencies and access sensitive data is unconstitutional. What are your colleagues saying about the authority that's been given to Musk and his DOGE team without congressional approval? And how do you expect this to play out in courts?
Well, initially, I think the opposition was really just from Democrats in the Congress, concerned about the unlawful nature of these actions, the harmful, destructive nature of these actions, thousands and thousands of Americans losing their jobs, but also losing important work that is really central to our national security interests, the dismantling of USAID, for example. Here in Munich, we've been talking to our partners about how that just abandons the field around the world for China to move in and secure basing rights and mineral rights because we're no longer in the development business around the world. So it started out just, I think, mostly Democrats pushing back, but now you're starting to see Republicans in different parts of the country who are deeply impacted. You've got my colleagues who are losing jobs in the Forest Service, and you've got other my colleagues that are representing farm states and are losing export opportunities. So I think we're starting to see more bipartisan pushback. But one thing I think it's really important for the American people to understand that's really behind all this. Why these cuts? Why the urgency? Why is the Trump administration and Elon Musk doing this? Basically, they need to come up with trillions to fund a tax cut for wealthy people and corporations.
Democrats are demanding an additional hearing to question Trump's pick to lead the FBI. Kash Patel, alleging that he was involved in recent firings at the Bureau and even may have perjured himself at his confirmation hearing. So a lot of his responses to you were, "Not that I recall." Will any of this stall his confirmation? And do you think he's being put in place to take action against agents who may have worked on cases involving Donald Trump?
We have whistleblower information, according to our ranking member, who that indicate that Patel was deeply involved in the firing of these top-level FBI agents and officers. And during the hearing, during his confirmation hearing, we asked him about this. Did he have knowledge about this? And as you were saying, when I asked these questions.
So, folks, I can tell you that I can guarantee that in many allied countries, law enforcement, the military, they're being called because Trump, in a sense, is threatening the survival of these countries with his bad deals, right? So if you're like police in Ukraine, you're being called and get ready for what Trump is effectively setting up as a death threat for your country, basically being, accept the deal we're going to negotiate for you, or it's annihilation. But there have been some reports, guys, that the United States will be having a meeting, I think, in Saudi Arabia. So already alarm bells are ringing. One of the most evil countries on earth. We got to be clear. They're having a meeting there with Russia. So American officials, Russian officials will be meeting in Saudi. But apparently, and maybe this will change, Ukraine is not invited. Can you imagine? This is a quote often attributed to Ann Richards, former Democratic governor of Texas, but I've heard it lots of other places. You guys know this. If you're not at the table, boy, oh boy, you're on the menu. If you're not there having discussions, and those discussions pertain to you, then they are figuring out how best to divide you and eat you for dinner. And lunch and breakfast and dessert too. That's what's happening here. And so what we're seeing is Trump make a death threat to Ukrainian sovereignty and to American democracy. And law enforcement in the states and in other places, law enforcement including attorneys general, who are top cops, they are cops, they are coming after Trump.